of Ottawa, a quotation, then a video clip. Here's the quotation. You, in a message you taped for the protesters, I'd like to commend all of you for your diligence and work on accomplishing what you have under trying conditions, and also for keeping your heads in a way that's been a model for the entire world, close quote. Now the clip.
It has to stop. The people of Ottawa don't deserve to be harassed in their own neighborhoods. They don't deserve to be confronted with the inherent violence of a swastika flying on a street corner, or a Confederate flag, or the insults and jeers just because they're wearing a mask. That's not who Canadians are.
All right, so
I can hardly even look at him.
Here's the first question. How can discourse in a great democracy have become so polarized that Jordan Peterson and the Prime Minister look at exactly the same set of events and come to opposite conclusions about them?
Well, he's lying, and I'm not. So that's a big part of the issue. I don't believe that he ever says a word that's true. From what I've been able to observe, it's all stage acting. He's crafted a persona. He has a particular instrumental goal in mind, and everything is subordinated to serve that.
Why?
So,
what's the motivation?
The same motivation that's generally typical of people who are narcissistic, which is to be accredited with moral virtue in the absence of the work necessary to actually attain it.
All right.
He's playing a role. You know, the swastika thing, it's like, really,
just untrue.
About Canadians, really, we're going to be worried about Nazis in Canada? Because I had protests, for example, where people accused me of attracting Nazis. First of all, that just isn't a thing in Canada. There isn't a Nazi tradition. And I don't know anyone in Canada who's ever met anyone who's met someone who was Canadian and who was a Nazi. And so that's just a non-starter. And so when that sort of thing gets dragged into the conversation, right off the bat, you know, the Canadians shouldn't be subjected to the inherent violence of a swastika. First of all, it's not even obvious what that swastika was doing there. There's reasonable evidence to suggest that the person who was waving it was either a plant or someone who was making the comment that that was what was characteristic of the government, not of what they believed. Now, no one knows, because the story around that event is messy, and it's not like there were credible journalists who were going in there to investigate thoroughly. But to use that and the Confederate flag issue is exactly the same thing. You know, the story in Canada, our Prime Minister implemented the Emergencies Act, and so the question was why? And so I went on Twitter when this was trending and read at least 5,000 Twitter comments to try to get a sense. These were people who were supporting Trudeau in his application of the Emergencies Act. And I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do they believe is happening? And the story seemed to be, and this is as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, the story was something like, "Make America Great Again." Conservative Republicans on the, pretty far right were attempting to destabilize Canadian democracy. And so my question was, well, what makes you think they care, first of all, about Canada and its democracy? And second, why in the world would they possibly do that? You need a motive for a crime like that. And that was at the same time the CBC was insisting, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is subsidized by the Liberals to the tune of $1.2 billion a year, was insisting that most of the money that the truckers raised was foreign financed. If it wasn't the bloody Russians, then it was the American conservatives. And so that all turned out to be a complete lie. And so, fine, it's Republican right-wingers trying to destabilize Canadian democracy. Why? No one has an answer for that, because what's in it for them? And then, okay, 3 days later, the Emergency Act was lifted. And I thought, okay, now what are they going to make of that? What could possibly be the rationale for that? And the rationale was, well, that just shows you how effective he was. We had this coup ready to go that was financed by Americans, apparently, and our Prime Minister acted so forthrightly that we only needed to be under the strictures of the Emergency Act for 3 days. It's like, okay, I don't even know what sort of world I exist in where those things are happening. So, and then Canadians, why do Canadians buy this to the degree they do? And I think they're faced with a hard choice, because in my country, for 150 years, you could trust the basic institutions. You could trust the government. It didn't matter what political party was running it. You could trust the political parties, right from the socialists over to the conservatives. The socialists were mostly union types, and they were trying to give the working class a voice, and honestly so. You could trust the media. Even the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was a reliable source of news. None of that's true now, and so Canadians are asked to make a hard choice, or were in the truckers' convoy situation, and the choice was, well, either all your institutions are almost irretrievably corrupt, or the truckers were financed by like right-wing Republican Americans. Well, both of those are preposterous. You might as well take the one that's least disruptive to your entire sense of security. And so I think that's what Canadians did, mostly.
All right. I'll come back to Canada. Universities. Jordan Peterson in the National Post this past March, quote, "I'd envisioned teaching and researching at the University of Toronto full-time until they had to haul my skeleton out of my office.
Yeah.
Instead, you retired. Why?"
Yeah. Well, it was impossible to go back. I mean, I couldn't think clearly about what I should do on the professional front for a long time because I was ill. But when I started to recover and looked at the situation, first of all, there was just no going back. I'm too well known and too provocative, I suppose. I've never really thought of myself that way, but it seems to have turned out that way. I couldn't just return to the classroom. And then there were other problems too. There's no bloody way I'm writing a diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement for a grant. I can't imagine the circumstances under which I would do that. And that's absolutely crucial now in Canada and increasingly in the US. To get any sort of research grant, you have to write a diversity statement. And it has to be the right kind of statement. I read the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council's frequently asked questions about how to prepare a diversity statement. And you couldn't write a more reprehensible document from the ideological perspective if you set out with the intent purpose of writing a reprehensible document. And so there's no way I could get funding for my research. And then my students, what bloody chance do they have of being hired in an academic environment today? You know perfectly well, those of you who sat on faculty hiring committees, your basic decision right off the bat is, okay, who do we eliminate? Because you have way too many candidates. And so you're searching for reasons to get rid of people. And I'm not saying this as a criticism even, it's just a reality. And any whiff of scandal of any sort, it's like, well, we have 10 other people we could look at. Why would we bother with the trouble? And so I just couldn't see my students having any future. And then I also thought, well, I can go lecture wherever I want to whoever I want, with virtually any size audience with no restrictions whatsoever. Why would I go back to teaching a small class at a university? You know, not that I didn't like that, because I did like it, but not all I could see were disadvantages. Plus it was impossible, so that was why.
So again from you in the National Post, just exactly what am I supposed to do when I meet a graduate student or a young professor hired on diversity grounds? Manifest instant skepticism? What a slap in the face. The diversity ideology is no friend to peace and tolerance. It is absolutely and completely the enemy of competence and justice, close quote. What happened? How did wokeness, we can come to this in a moment too, university faculty, poll after poll of party affiliation in this country, I'm sure it's the same in Canada, the university faculty have been to the left for a long time. But this wokeness is something new. What's the transmission mechanism? What happened? And how did it happen in still a small single-digit number of years?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question, you know. I mean, I've tried to put my finger on the essential elements of what you might describe as political correctness or wokeness, and I've done that a variety of ways. I had a student, for example, This is quite a promising line of research. Her name, Christine Brophy, was her name. The first thing we wanted to find out was, well, is there really such a thing as political correctness or wokeness, right? Because it's vague.
Can you identify it?
Yeah, yeah, and I meant that psychometrically, because psychologists for 40 years have been trying to, one of the things that psychologists have been wrestling with is construct validation. That's the technical problem, is how do you know when you put a concept forward whether it bears any relationship to some underlying reality? And so you can think of, well, is there such a thing as emotional intelligence? Is there such a thing as self-esteem? Is there such a thing as political correctness? Mm-hmm. And so the proper answer to that is, well, we don't know, but there are ways of finding out. And so one of the ways you find out is you want to see if the construct assesses something that's unique, and that it does that in a manner that's separate from other similar constructs in a revealing and important way. There's a whole theory of methodology that should inform your efforts to answer such questions. So, for example, if you're a clinician, you might want to differentiate between depression and anxiety, keeping the concepts importantly separate so they have functional utility, but also accounting for the overlap because they're both negative emotions, for example. It's part of epistemological mapping. And so we asked a large number of people, a very large number of political questions, trying to oversample questions that had been put forward in the media and in the public sphere as indicative of politically correct beliefs. Right. And then we did the appropriate statistical analysis to see if the questions hung together. And so they hang together if question A is politically correct, let's say, you answer it positively, and question B is politically correct, and you answer it positively. If there's a large correlation between those two questions, then you think, well, they're assessing some underlying, I don't have to tell you all this, but you know this if you know anything about statistics, then you know that there's something underlying that's holding them together. And we identified a set of beliefs that were observable or identifiable, easily identifiable as politically correct. So then the question, so that it exists, then the question is, well, where does it come from? And we haven't done empirical analysis of that, but I think if you're reasonably familiar with the history of ideas, you can see two streams, two broad streams. One is a postmodern stream that basically emerged out of literary criticism, and it's predicated on what I think is actually a fundamental and a valid critique, which is that it's very, very difficult to lay out a description of the world without that description being informed by some value structure. That's at the core of what's useful about the postmodern critique. I think that's at the core.